Hello, everyone. To explain, well, might as well get down to it, shall we? Um, we've got quite a few people. That is certainly, well, no, we don't have very many people. But to explain the situation, this Mutants and Masterminds game is going to be a short campaign, roughly 1 to 3 months, at 3 months at the most. The campaign is called The Cradle Will Fall, which is a very blatant reference to Final Fantasy 13, one of the soundtracks from the official soundtrack of that game. If you're a Final Fantasy fan, you would probably catch it. Though Final Fantasy 13 is kind of like a split in the Final Fantasy community because some people like it, some people don't. It's a very controversial game, I would say, in my own opinion, but that's beside the point. But The Cradle Will Fall takes place in Freedom City in the year 2026. Currently, our young heroes, are teenagers either coming into sophomore year or coming into junior year of high school. And we have 4 characters to start out with. We have Chirrut, Silver Tiger, Spike, and Slayer. Chirrut is a telekinetic, electricity spewing teenager who's the awkward of the 4. He is the one who is often referred to as a nerd. He's the nerdy kid who kind of sticks to himself and kind of plays Magic and Dungeons and Dragons in his mom's basement. Kind of like that. But Silver Tiger, on the other hand, Silver Tiger, who's Chirrut and Silver Tiger are both juniors. Silver Tiger is, how should I put it? Is a teleporting martial artist. To put that lightly, he was trained by his grandfather in his martial arts, to fight bad guys and whatnot, or whatever he wants to fight. Though the grandfather would have specifically told him not to go out and start fights, but actually finish fights. So, Silver Tiger is taught in that way. Next is Spike. Spike is a speedster. If you know anything about comic book, speedsters are those who have super speed. They wholeheartedly go into super speed. But that aside, we have Slayer, who is, well, without going too much into the character. Essentially, it is like a Deadshot, the Knights from the Dark Tower series, from Stephen King's The Dark Tower. I wouldn't say Deadpool, but the uncanny marksmanship of Deadshot, for example. It's kind of the player kind of based it off of those kinds of characters, and so that's where Slayer comes from. But both Spike and Slayer were oddball freshmen last year, but now are returning for their sophomore year. And where these 4 characters attend, is Joseph Clark High School, which is in Lincoln, which is within Freedom City. I'm using the setting Freedom City because I am too lazy to come up with a better setting. Freedom City sounds like the perfect setting for this kind of story I have planned. So, Joseph Clark High School, to explain it in more or less brief terms, Joseph Clark High School is a high school that allows both average and extraordinary students. Extraordinary meaning people like Silver Tiger or Slayer or Spike, kids like that. And this is a co-ed school, meaning that both students, average students, and extraordinary students study together. But the extraordinary students have their own courses, in terms of how they become heroes. because in this universe here, superheroes are not uncommon. They're definitely not all over the place, but they're not uncommon either. So the government would have a strict sort of policy when dealing with new upcoming superheroes. So every hero that goes to every superhero or supervillain that every superpowered being goes every time a superpowered being goes to a school or a governmental establishment, they have to be registered because there was a crisis, quote unquote, that happened about 10 to 20 years ago. This was called the Nova Crisis, and the Nova Crisis was essentially undocumented heroes and supervillains duking it out and destroying all sorts of property. And the inevitable political fallout of whether or not having undocumented superheroes, whether it's superheroes and supervillains, was a good idea or not. And then that bill eventually passed through, and now we have registered superheroes and supervillains. Can't forget them. But that aside, our story starts in Joseph Clark High School, where a individual who will not be named just yet is seeking to start a group because essentially there's something going on in Lincoln that calls for this particular individual's attention, and he needs help. So he eventually will recruit these characters into a sort of hero group in order to protect Lincoln from the inevitable evil that will be brought on upon Lincoln and eventually throughout the South of Freedom City. So yeah, that is the sort of campaign in full. And I hope to see everyone, hope to see feedback on all of these explanations of each individual session. This explanation in particular will be for the first session, which will be coming up next Tuesday. So pretty much that is all there is to explain about the story as of now. Though I will kind of share a bit into the kind of setting in general. Freedom City, this version of Freedom City does not have the same sort of mainstream superheroes that there are in the canon Freedom City, in the official Freedom City. This is a non-official Freedom City in which the world is kind of coming to terms, well, not coming to terms, but more or less accepting superheroes and supervillains or superpowered beings. They're kind of accepting that there is a cosmology at play here, and that average citizens are trying to figure out how to deal with this cosmology, while at the same time trying to live their average lives. But there are a couple events throughout the history of this universe, that may need some explanation because it will be referred to multiple times throughout these explanations, throughout these explanation videos. So, to put it in a sort of idea, back in the 1940s to 1950s, a mainstream hero of World War II, mind you, because World War II didn't last that long. It didn't last the 4 years that it did in our time, but instead it only lasted 2, so we only lasted half as long because of superpowered humans, or superpowered beings, my bad. So during World War II, a mainstream hero by the name of Cannonball came to the forefront. Cannonball is, well, not your typical Superman-like hero. In fact, he's more like a toned-down Superman. Definitely a toned-down Superman. Cannonball is like a human wrecking ball, essentially. He has impervious like skin, so that whenever he takes a shot, he can just shrug it off and keep going. That's all. That's all he's really good for. He can leap, but he can't fly. But Cannonball was part of the initial push to Germany, because during that time, Cannonball had gained a lot of traction, because in World War II, superpowered beings weren't really considered, or were heavily considered to be martial weapons. They were considered to be weapons, for winning the war. And so both sides, both the Axis and the Allies, were both using superpowered humans. That aside, Cannonball in particular was working for the Allies. He was there on D-Day. He was there for pretty much most of the Allied major battles, aside from the Africa campaign. He wasn't there during the Africa campaign. He was there mostly for the European campaign, and then eventually left for the Pacific campaign, because after Europe had won, the Pacific was still going on, and Japan was still trying to whoop our ass, but we were whooping their ass. That was so. But the reason to now you're wondering why Cannonball was so important, because Cannonball is the one who brought superheroes to the mainstream. Like, superheroes on the side of the Allies is what brought them to the mainstream. And Cannonball was definitely there during the whole Cold War. He was the poster boy for America. So, train incoming. Oh boy. But that is, don't worry about the background noise of the train that's going to come in for like a couple seconds and blare its ugly ass horn, because I live near a main line. But that, all that aside, Cannonball is, again, a poster boy. He's the poster boy, for like freedom and capitalism. You know what I mean? And there was also a communist poster boy named Red Stone. And Red Stone is basically the literal stone counterpart to Goliath in the X-Men. Instead of him being made of steel, he's made of stone. And he is a communist superhero, quote unquote. But Cannonball and Redstone, these poster boys, were of course the mainstream heroes at the time, and this is what kind of propelled heroes to the mainstream. People were thought, okay, these superheroes and supervillains have all these amazing powers that we didn't even think of existed at the time, because way back during the Victorian era, superheroes weren't even thought of. Like, they were thought of in stories. People were like, oh yeah, we saw this one guy pick up an entire building and toss it a couple 100 yards without even trying. That's just crazy. But yeah, so Cannonball and Redstone boosted superpowered humans, superpowered beings to the forefront. And so now, after the Cold War had, ended, because it never really ended, just saying, it never really ended. Now we have these. Now we come to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, where superheroes just keep coming forward and forward and forward, to the point where it's common to see a superhero fight super evil. Like, it's common for a superhero or a supervillain to go duke it out in the middle of the street. You don't see it every day, but you see it every week or so, every couple weeks. There's always that big villain that be like, okay, we want to take over the world, like every other villain for the last 30 or 40 years. So every couple of weeks or so, you do see like that supervillain duke out. So now, coming to today, past another crisis, like I've already explained, it was a crisis dealing with the political fallout of the quote unquote supervillain war that happened in the sort of toned down Freedom City. That Freedom City wasn't as big as it was now. This is the kind of the to explain why this is up. This is the map of the campaign. This is where everything is going to be taking place. This is to the south of Freedom City, but I'm getting off point. But coming through the Nova Crisis and coming to now, superheroes and supervillains, if they go through the penitentiary, if they go to jail, if they go to a government building, if they go to school, if they even apply for a job, they all have to be registered, regardless. If you have superpowers, you're going to have to be registered. There's no escaping it, or else you're just going to be a supervillain, an unregistered supervillain. So that is the cold hard. That is the cold hard fact about superheroes and supervillains in this universe. They have to be registered. Like, if they get caught, they're registered. You know, if supervillains get caught, then you might be asking yourself, how do supervillains get registered? They get registered if they get caught by police, other superheroes, or get caught on camera, and they happen to find old files of who you were and such and such. But yeah, that's how supervillains get registered. So that's more or less the kind of the idea of behind this version of the Freedom City and this version of Earth, which I like to call Earth 1. So this is Earth 1, and that is what happens. You know, that's kind of like the brief history of what happens. The brief history of this Earth in particular. Now, I won't get into the cosmology because that's a whole another situation in and of itself that I probably will go over at some point, probably towards the end of the campaign. So, yeah, I do look forward to your feedback on all this, everyone, and I do hope that that this gets off the ground. So, yeah, bye.